How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. So in today's video I wanted to look at a very specific type of house music synth that I'm hearing a lot in tracks from the likes of like Chris Stussy and various other names in that kind of house music domain. Here is a teaser of what we're going to be looking at today. As always, I'll be leaving the full project with all the samples and all the channels frozen, so be sure to check that out if you want that. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So I think the best place to begin is with a kind of demonstration of that sound that I'm referring to. So the sound I'm referring to is essentially these fifth synths, which are pretty versatile. Like, you can use them for basses, you can use them for chords, pad layers. There's so many different use cases for them. So the first example I've got is this track by an artist called Gigsta called Warehouse Music. It's essentially using this kind of synth pad chord sound, which is kind of the perfect example of what I'm talking about. So the sound is essentially a fifth synth, and what this is basically the root note plus a fifth above, and it creates this kind of chord effect. So the technique is pretty similar across the board, but the sound tends to vary. So we've got this one here, which is kind of used as a chord. The next one I'll go to is an artist called Candidate. DXNBY is another artist that uses this sound. And then the final example, which we all know, is this one, which I think is just the best example of this. Those are essentially the examples. So I've obviously shown a few examples of tracks that are utilizing this sound. I've also kind of created my own track, kind of a bit influenced by Stussy, but with a few different fifth layers just to show where you can maybe use them. So this is kind of like the fifth chord. We've got this fifth bass. And I've got these fifth pads. So I've got these fifth pads, got these fifth chords, and this fifth bass up here. These are like the three main layers. The first thing that I would normally do with this is start with the sound. So for this one, I like the ProMars plugin by Roland Cloud, and normally I just go for the very first preset, which will sound like this. Something else you could do is you could try like Diva. Basically just search fifth and just see what comes out. So I think I picked this one because it just instantly gave me like Stussy vibes. So essentially, in a nutshell, a lot of my process is just using those kind of fifth presets. Then what I do is I just start playing in like patterns. Because the nature of the sound is a fifth synth, what it's essentially doing is taking the root note and transposing it up 7 semitones to create a fifth. So when it comes to the actual MIDI itself, because the sound's already a chord, you can kind of keep the MIDI a bit more simple, and you can stick with these like single line patterns. So a very kind of simple melody there. And then this fifth bass, I believe, just does the same thing, but it's lower down, so it kind of adds depth to that. So you can essentially pick these kind of fifth synth patches. You can keep the MIDI fairly simple, and then the world's kind of your oyster when it comes to processing. So if I demonstrate on this one, I've got a lot of the kind of standard stuff, as you'll see, and then modulation's kind of playing a big part in this sound. I've got this phaser, and then I've got this effect rack, which is doing all sorts. It's basically using Echo Boy to apply character to the sound. It's sweeping to make it more interesting and continuously moving. It's adding some depth with microshift. So there's a lot of like kind of modulation and filter movement going on. And then delay and reverb just transform the sound massively. For the bass, it kind of sits a bit higher than you would normally expect the bass to sit. So I kind of have more freedom, and because of that I've used like reverb and delay to make it really spacey. So those are just a few examples of how I'd maybe consider using the fifth synth sound. I've obviously spoken about my examples. Something I've not really mentioned is how you'd maybe approach creating this sound from scratch. I normally opt for going for those presets because they've kind of carefully considered the sounds and what might work in a chord polyphonic kind of format. But if you did want to try this technique on different sounds, then we'll kind of just run through that now. So what I'll normally do is find a nice plugin, and we'll just go on the kind of default. So you can addition a lot of stuff by just like literally playing a fifth chord. What you can do as well is you can go to the Ableton chord device up here, and you can basically transpose it up 7 semitones, which literally is a fifth. Or you could duplicate the layer and have one of the layers go +7. So different ways of doing the same thing essentially. Then all you really need to do is choose a sound that fits that. There's not really any rules when it comes to the actual sound selection. I'd basically be looking in synths mostly if I wanted to go for like chords and pads. You could even look in bass, but here I'd advise you to take caution just because a lot of these sounds are like monophonic layers. So you might have to go down here and change it to one of the poly modes. We'll try and find an example. So I think you could definitely find something in the kind of bass category if you looked long enough, but I think the kind of go-to is the kind of polyphonic patches. So that, in a nutshell, is essentially how I would go about creating these sounds from scratch. That's pretty much going to conclude our tutorial covering that popular fifth synth sound, which can be used for anything from your bass lines right up to your pads. Hopefully it's a technique that you've learned a lot about, and it's a sound that you might go away and experiment with in your projects. If you like the video, then be sure to let me know by leaving a like, subscribing, leave a comment. All that is appreciated. And if you want to support us, then do be sure to check out our Patreon, where the projects can be linked, and check out our store as well for various other resources that might take your fancy. See you in the next one.